Hey everybody, well, we made it to week 3. We're making good progress with the course, and now we're on to what I would consider the second section of a 4-part course here. And the second section includes the 3 branches of government. So we're going to examine the executive, legislative, and judicial, then we'll take another quiz on these 3 weeks. So let's start off with the executive. So this week's learning objectives, we have a lot, but a lot of this is review for the most part, and it is well embedded with a lot of what we understand through our traditional engagement with politics. So I think we'll be able to understand a lot of this and be able to very easily answer 10 in-depth questions on government and the executive branch. So first, we're going to understand the general structures of the executive. We're going to interpret some of the primary actors within the executive branch, the president, vice president, governors, mayors, we're going to also identify the makeup and general role of the bureaucracy and cabinet, 2 segments of the executive. We also want to look into the 2-step impeachment process and understand very concretely the history of the impeachment process and how it operates in case we see this process be implemented in the future. We also want to examine the checks and balances that the other branches have on the executive. Of course, we will be doing this for every branch. Understand the upcoming summary assignment. I won't be going into too much detail, but it is important for you to complete that assignment. We're going to write summaries of some of 1 or 2 of the readings. The detail is in the document. I forget if I canceled out one of those readings, but you will see in the document, follow those directions and provide summaries that are as close to the 200, I believe it's 250 word mark as possible. And there will be point deductions if you go over, so keep an eye on that. We're also going to interpret the responsibility and makeup of the cabinet bureaucracy. I already said that. Sorry, a bit of this is a little repetitive, but let's get going and learn about the executive branch. So, overview of the executive. So for one, some of the most simple details when we consider the executive branch, this is the branch in which the president operates. Think of it as, when you oversimplify it, like the managerial section of our government. This is designed to be a check on unreasonable legislative bodies, because when you think about it, when power is distributed in government, who holds theoretically the most power? It is those who have the ability to write the laws. And what does the president do? They do not write the laws individually. They act as a check on the legislative body, our Congress, who has the power to write and draft legislation. So the main actors within the executive branch include the president, vice president, the cabinet, bureaucracy, and governors, among other positions. So let's talk about that most important overarching position, the president, also referred to as the head of state, the chief executive, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, the chief diplomat, the chief legislator of the U.S., and leader of the political party that they identify with. That's a lot. Well, what do all those responsibilities entail? We'll cover it in just a few slides, but some of the simplest overview. If you want to become the president, if this is next up on the docket, graduate from FECC, become the president, there you go. It's a good next step. I approve. I'd be a recommendation. Requirements for that office: you have to be a naturalized born citizen. You have to be 35 years or older. So, some of us might not be able to do that. And you also have to be a resident of the United States for the last 14 years. So when you do obtain this office, you can make you do make $400,000 a year, plus a $169,000 stipend for expenses and many of the services that presidents require, like extra security and various funds that have to be put in when a president visits various locations. And I want to revisit that one requirement for office, being a natural born citizen, as we have had an individual run for president in the past few years that points out the gray areas of this. You can be born in a separate country to American parents. A great example is many individuals are the children of active military members who were born abroad. One individual, Ted Cruz, was born in Canada and ran for president in previous presidential elections. And we see he was able to do that because he was a natural born citizen, although he was born on Canada's territory. So you do have to be a natural born U.S. citizen, although you don't specifically have to be born on U.S. soil. But you see that as the test for the vast majority. So to become the president, You have to go through an election process because what are we? We are a representative democracy. Remember, Madison would have called it a republic, but representation is what founds our democracy. So electing the president. We have parties that nominate candidates every 4 years. It is important to note, and we'll go into more detail on this later on in this course, that the parties have control of their primary processes. The political parties control who their candidates are to a minimal degree through elections and through conventions. We also see that citizens do not necessarily directly vote for the president. We see that because we do not base who becomes the president off of the popular vote. Instead, we use the Electoral College. Again, another detail we will go in more detail on later on in this course. So citizens cast their ballot for presidential electors, who then vote for the president and vice president in the Electoral College. You see, if you look at the primary process, you'll see that at the RNC or DNC convention, they do a roll call vote in which the electors from each state cast their official vote for who the party nominee will be. We almost never see challenges occur at these conventions in contemporary years. Now, when we are electing the president, as we remember from what is established in the 12th Amendment, if there is a tie, the House of Representatives, if there is a tie among electors, of course, the House of Representatives steps in and acts as the tie-breaking vote for president. So we do see that this has been done in the past, but not since the 1800s. So we will not be going in detail on those processes. But it is very important to know what the 12th Amendment did as we covered it in last week's lecture. Sorry if the rhythm's disrupted. I accidentally hit the next button and it makes the recording go all over the place. So I had to delete and restart, and here we are. So before we talk about the specific powers and actions that a president can take, we want to look at the general types of powers that they have. And we're really making a primary distinction between expressed and inherent powers, while also understanding what an emergency power is and how that expands presidential authority in times of national crisis. So first off, what is an express power? An express power is a power directly written in our Constitution or statutory law. Remember, statutory law is any laws written, established, and signed by Congress and later signed by the president as well, as that is the last step in the legislative process we will learn about next week. But when we talk about express powers, you have the primary distinction right here between constitutional powers, powers directly granted in the Constitution, or statutory powers, powers granted through laws enacted by Congress, as I just previously mentioned. Now, when these are express laws, they're directly written. It's easy to regulate the powers of the president through strict interpretations of express laws, as we've seen time and time again, as they are, in addition to expanding the powers of the president and illustrating what the president can do, they often also entail regulations on how the president must operate in those times. We also see inherent powers. These are defined through practice rather than through the law, and they're not directly written in the Constitution. You could think of inherent powers as the gray area of presidential action, which many presidents utilize, and we do see a lot of presidents utilize inherent powers in times of peace and crisis. You see in our Constitution, it says directly, the president should take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And while that does directly designate a power to the executive branch, the head of the executive, the president, it also doesn't say exactly how it must be done, allowing for some gray area of interpretation. Now, we also see emergency powers. We see that sometimes these inherent powers are expanded and exercised by the president in times of national crisis in reference to certain emergencies at the time. You do have to declare a state of emergency to do so. We have seen state of emergencies declared anywhere from social unrest to environmental catastrophes. So it's not exclusively for social unrest. It also is used for environmental crises and various other moments like that. Think of another emergency power, national security threat, and like on 9/11 and closing down all airports, things of that nature. Powers of the president. So like I said before, the job title is expansive. Head of state, chief executive, chief legislator of the U.S., commander-in-chief of the armed forces, chief diplomat, and leader of the political party. But what does all that entail? Well, each of those titles, to a degree, helps expand and describe the powers of the president. And here are the actions that the president is granted. The president has appointment powers. Appointment powers means the president determines who maintains the seats within the cabinet, subcabinet, often has the power to appoint federal judgeships, agency heads, and many others. There are roughly 9,000 positions total that the president has the power to appoint, and we do see that there are various, not real established committees, but collectives of individuals the president will work with to identify who can take up these positions. And you do not see a president ever appoint 9,000 entire positions, as federal judgeships are oftentimes lifelong positions, and they have the power to replace retiring or impeached federal judges. So you see that number is far lower than 9,000 for each presidential term, although the power is quite expansive. We do also see that the Senate is responsible for approving presidential appointments, and that is something we'll go into more detail later on, as there has been conflict through this process in recent years revolving around the filibuster and use of the nuclear option. Fascinating discussions. In addition, we've also learned that the president has the power to grant pardons, but pardons also pardons are a bit more expansive than simply just saying you're forgiven for your crimes. We also have reprieves and commutations. Now, a reprieve is a postponement of the execution of a federal sentence. Say you have to serve a lifetime in jail and you're 60 years old, you might have the chance to have a reprieve and have your sentence be delayed 10 years. If you have a terminal illness, so those cases have existed where they're basically said, like, you have the chance to live out the rest of your life, although we're not saying that you're completely innocent. In a way, pardon is released from all punishments relating to a crime, regardless of whether they are in jail or haven't been in jail, whether they've been convicted or not convicted. And a commutation is a reduction of time to be served while the conviction is still present. You will get out of jail possibly, although you will still be a felon in some states. You will no longer have that time that you will have to serve. So you see that this also only relates to federal charges. You do not see individuals pardoned for state crimes, as that is a task granted to the governor, who is the head of the executive on the state level, and we'll go into more detail on that later on. But the president can pardon federal crimes, and some cases of past presidential pardons include Jimmy Carter pardoning draft resistors after Vietnam protests. You see all Confederate soldiers pardoned by Andrew Johnson. You see Ford pardoning Richard Nixon. So there have been many, many pardons throughout U.S. history. We have recent pardons led by Donald Trump that are of interesting political discussions. We remember the first day he pardoned many of the January 6th individuals, no matter how you would frame that, the participants on that day. And that was an action that encouraged much political engagement and discussion. And we have seen pardons like that come from nearly all presidents. So it's a fascinating point of debate that you often engage with in politics, but it is a power directly granted to our president to grant reprieves, pardons, and commutations. Now, we also see wartime powers. The president is the ultimate decision maker when it comes to military matters. And this has resulted in troops being sent many places and even nuclear bombs being used at various times in our history, two in particular, and thankfully just those two, and hopefully no more. But the president has the power to be the final send-off on many specific missions. We see operations like the operations that caught many leading terrorist organizers like Osama bin Laden or al-Baghdadi. We see that, operations approved by Barack Obama and Donald Trump resulted in their captures. And we also see that they are oftentimes the individual with the final say in times of most significant national crises, as they work closely with the generals. Now, there's a bit more to becoming the president. You can do a lot more. So you can also nationalize the National Guard, and this is a sentence I always say, and I say nationalize way too many times when I say it. National disasters or severe social unrest at various times have warranted the president to nationalize the National Guard in response. We see that this happened at I believe it was Kent State or Ohio State, one of those two colleges. I always mix them up. In the 70s, a protest against the Vietnam War resulted in some college students being shot and killed in those moments. There's a very famous photo of a girl, college student, at the protest on her knees in front of an individual who was just shot and killed, another college student, as she had her arms out, pleading why, which became a very public and popular photo summarizing that moment in our U.S. history. We also see the National Guard has been mobilized for natural disasters. Think of Hurricane Katrina and the various southeastern hurricanes that have devastated regions, the fires of the Northwest, and the tornadoes of the central regions of this country. We also see, I believe I've heard discussions in recent days about some conflict, some social unrest happening in LA, and there has been discussion and debate about using the National Guard. That is, your opinions are your opinions and fully supported in whatever you believe. I honestly have not engaged with this at all. I've read one headline and moved on, so I have no comment on the topic, but I know that this was something that either individuals are discussing as a possible move that the president can make, or the president has discussed it as a possible option. I don't know, but it is a power that the president has during times of civil unrest or natural disasters. We also see that the president has the power of diplomatic recognition and the ability to sign treaties. This is a very significant power, and we can think about one international conflict occurring right now and understand this power quite clearly through that. We know that in the conflict between Israel and Palestine, that is a conflict of regarding territory, similar to Ukraine, Russia, but it's a long-lasting battle over a specific territory, the Palestinian region of Israel, or however you want to frame that. And we see that past diplomatic recognitions by presidents have helped establish Israel as a true nation, as a nation state within that territory, as the United States and others immediately recognize the state once during its creation in the 1950s. It's a very complex and historical issue, and there is a lot of nuance and validity on both sides of the discussion. It's a region of with a depth of cultural conflict, and we see that playing out in today. But the power of diplomatic recognition can be seen through how well established Israel is today in response to previous diplomatic recognition by leading Western democracies and other nations globally. We also see the opposite side of this in the territory that the Taliban obtained in Afghanistan. And when we did not recognize the Afghanistan state, it resulted in various trade restrictions being implemented on that state, that region, and their leadership not being able to gain true recognition on the international stage, which harms their ability to build up the state on any significant level. So and additionally, I don't know why every word is capitalized on this slide. I just noticed sometimes I change the formatting and it changes these things. That's weird. Not grammatically correct, but we'll move on. But we also see that the Senate has to ratify and approve of all treaties made by the president. And although we do not see them having to approve of diplomatic recognition. So we see, and also we also have the power of executive agreements. The president can make agreements with other state leaders, other heads of their executives, if their government is structured similarly. We see that these meetings in the Oval Office are often representative of various executive agreements. We see Zelensky was visiting Donald Trump, and they had discussions and debates that are still ongoing and could result in an executive agreement. And we see that happening routinely over the years. We also see that the president gives a speech quite routinely as well, called the State of the Union, in which the president has the ability to really set the congressional agenda and establish what their regime is hoping to accomplish in their time period. And this is often a very noteworthy speech. It gives the general population an understanding of what their direct motivations are, what their next steps are in government. And in recent years, we've seen how Congress responds to the president's agenda in these moments through some significant periods of protest by legislators. on both sides of the political aisle. And I think there's a video on Eagle Online this week that just shows some of the most noteworthy moments from State of the Unions throughout our history. It's worth a watch. And we also see the president has the power to sign executive orders. Now this, it deserves its own slide. So let's continue on. And we'll cover the executive orders in just a slide. I should have moved it up, but we got vetoes first. So what is the presidential veto power? It states that, I was reading one of my notes. I thought I had a direct quote from the Constitution. I do not. So once the legislative branch drafts and approves a bill through the House and then the Senate, it goes to the president for the final approval. The president's signature is the final step of a four-step process to have legislation become law. And it's like that old video, how bill becomes a bill up on Capitol Hill, Schoolhouse Rock. I'll post it. But we see that the last step is the president signing it into law. Well, the president can also refuse to and implement one of two types of vetoes. A veto is basically saying this law will not go into effect because of the president's single say. Well, a regular veto is when the president decides the law will not go into effect, and it often is signed with a veto message that specifies why it was vetoed. This is the most traditional avenue of veto that presidents have used in the past. They often say, if you add this to the bill or remove that piece of legislation, I won't veto it, etc. It's normally vetoed very purposely for a specific reason. Now, there's another avenue that the president can take which is a pocket veto. This is when the president refuses to sign a bill or to sign a veto or sign a bill into law directly. And each bill has a certain time period in which it is, say, live on the president's desk. And if the session ends and the bill is not signed into law or vetoed, Congress must reconsider it in the next session, and it must restart the legislative process. So, and this is one in which the president doesn't have to say a single thing about it, does not have to sign any documentation. They just simply let it die on their desk. This does also happen every blue moon. Now, executive orders, the exciting one. What does an executive order do? Well, when we give it a single overarching summary, an executive order establishes or modifies rules and practices of executive administrative agencies. We've seen in the last many years, executive orders take with expansive goals and objectives. We see, I have three examples here, but I also want to verbally mention President Joe Biden's past executive order in which he attempted to forgive student loan debt, but it was overturned by the U.S. courts as it utilized the power of the purse that is granted to the legislative branch exclusively. So we see that executive orders are oftentimes actually overturned by the U.S. courts, and both the Supreme Court and lower courts as well have in the past overturned executive orders. So when we look at them, we see that they enforce legislative statutes. So sometimes we see that legislation will be signed into law and then it's not being enforced properly, and it can work out the quirks to it. Say, what is an example of this? Say the federal government legalized something that was previously illegal, but the distribution of that product was not going optimally, and they needed to implement further regulations to maintain the effectiveness of this new legalization of whatever this product is. It could be marijuana or whatever destructive item, whatever you can imagine, whatever that is. An executive order would oftentimes help enforce the legislative statutes that were previously written through small quirks to it. We also see this, they enforce the Constitution or treaties with foreign nations through executive orders at times. But let's talk about some of our past executive orders through 4 different presidents. I already mentioned the Joe Biden executive order that was overturned by the U.S. courts. And let's start a little bit further back in history. Let's talk about George Bush and one of his executive orders to create the Department of Homeland Security, which happened in response to the tragic day of 9/11 in 2001. The executive order signed immediately following those events and was later reinforced by Congress. The president is able to sign an executive order to establish a new executive agency, because remember, establish or modify rules and practices of executive administrative agencies. They have the power to move those agencies around a bit. So George Bush concentrated various agencies that already existed relating to national security, immigration, and various other security issues, and put them all together under a unified objective under the Department of Homeland Security, and he appointed a department head for this new department. Well, that's all the president can do regarding those actions, and then Congress has to actually pass the Homeland Security Act, which later officially established the Department of Homeland Security in 2002, but it supported and approved of Bush's previous actions in the year prior, the late end of the year prior. We also can fast forward a bit to Barack Obama's term in office, as he signed an executive order heavily restricting unauthorized immigrants. This was actually overturned by the U.S. courts as an excessive use of his presidential powers at the time, and this was accepted by their term. And we do see that they did not implement a second attempt. An example of how executive orders are oftentimes, actually quite often, overturned by the courts and simply accepted as that. So one of the ways in which our judicial branch checks our executive. And we can fast forward to 2017 when President Donald Trump signed an executive order restricting immigration and travel from a various collection of countries. The first two versions of this executive order were blocked by the U.S. courts, and it was the third version, after we had some movement around which countries were included in the list and which weren't, that was accepted and approved by the courts. Fascinatingly, we have another executive order signed by Donald Trump in the last few weeks, I believe, that restricts travel from a different collection of countries. And at the moment, I believe there's no pushback on that travel restriction executive order. And through this slide, my reason for mentioning all three of these, I want to show one, that the courts overturn executive orders frequently, no matter what president signed the executive order, no matter what issue, the judicial branch has the sole responsibility of maintaining that we do not override the Constitution and grant too much power to the executive through these executive orders. We also want to see that sometimes this is very successful. Sometimes you can create executive agencies that will have a long-lasting impact on the security of the state, effectiveness of the state, like George Bush with the Homeland Security Act, and just generally understanding the powers of an executive order. They often address the gray areas of executive powers and are often checked by the courts, and the system has proven to be effective over time. Yeah. So now let's say we have a president sign one too many destructive executive orders and maybe get caught up in a little bit of a scandal. Now, we haven't impeached a president for that specific reason, that combination, according to my knowledge, but we have had some impeachments. So before we understand the history of impeachments, it's very important that we understand the impeachment process. If you Google this, it'll say, I think it's like 7 steps or 4 steps or something, or maybe 9. It varies. In this lecture, in this course, in the angle we are understanding it, impeachment is a 2-step process. The first step is referred to as impeachment, and it occurs within the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives determines if the president committed treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, and if the majority find him or her guilty of those charges, they will impeach the president. So what happens when you impeach a president? Absolutely nothing. Yet. That then goes to the second step of the process, which is removal from office. This is where the Senate then votes on impeachment. They will either, in this process, the Senate must have a 2/3 majority vote to remove the president from office. And if they vote in favor of removal, the president immediately resigns from office, and the vice president then takes their place, unless they were somehow involved. But that's never even been considered in past history. So let's talk about the history of the 2-step impeachment process that has existed in the United States. Well, we see no president has ever been removed from office by the U.S. Senate. We have never had the impeachment process completed. It is very important to understand that and remember that. We have had 4 successful impeachments led by the House of Representatives. These occurred in 1868, 1998, the year I was born, 2019, and 2021. 3 different presidents have been impeached by the House of Representatives. No presidents have been removed from office by the Senate, and 1 president has actually left office in response to the impeachment processes. Richard Nixon is the 1 president who resigned individually. He resigned from his post after the impeachment process, after the initiation of the impeachment process, although he was never impeached by the House. The 3 presidents who were successfully impeached by the House of Representatives, and of course we know Richard Nixon, if those processes were to continue, he was going to be impeached and most likely removed from office, and that's why he resigned. He didn't want to be the only president to have ever had that. And there was probably a lot more to it. But we also see the 3 presidents that have been impeached by the House of Representatives include Andrew Johnson, 1868. Due to internal conflicts, he was really standing in opposition to the Reconstruction era amendments and really the reestablishing of formerly enslaved individuals in the South. And that resulted in additional conflicts among him and other representatives, which brought him to be impeached in 1868. He did finish his term as president and did not run again. Bill Clinton in 1998, as we may all know, some of you might be a little too young to really remember this, but we saw his impeachment for the general reasoning was for lying under oath in regards to a public marital affair that he was a part of. So we see that occurred in 1998, but it is very important to remember Bill Clinton finished his term as president and was not removed from office. All of these individuals were acquitted by the Senate additionally. And then we see Donald Trump is the only president to have been successfully impeached by the House 2 times. This occurred in 2019 and 2021. Without going into the details of them, 2019 was in relation to conduct and how he interacted with the leader of Ukraine at the time. And 2021 was in relation to the events that occurred on January 6th and his involvement at the rally that occurred prior. Your beliefs and sentiments on those moments are yours, and I support them entirely, whatever they may be. I am not here to tell you what to think. I'm here to tell you the history of the United States and the structures of our government. And in our history, we have had 3 presidents impeached, 4 successful impeachments, 1 president removed from office, and nobody was ever removed from office by the United States Senate. 1 was removed from office due to resignation. Now, we've learned a lot about the president, what the president does, those kind of powers, some examples of presidential actions of the past. Now let's talk about the cabinet and the bureaucracy. Well, what's the differences? For one, the cabinet, this is simply viewed as an advisory group to the president. They're directly appointed by the president. Remember those 9,000 total positions that they have the opportunity to appoint? They never appoint 9,000. But out of those 9,000, roughly 26 positions represent heads of executive departments or positions within the cabinet. Some positions include the vice president, the White House chief of staff, U.S. trade representatives, administrator of the EPA, the heads of the departments like the Secretary of Agriculture and Commerce, Defense, Education, Energy, Health, Human Services, Homeland Security, Housing, Urban Development, Interior, Labor, State Transportation, Treasury, and Veterans Affairs, and many more that I'm not going to read out for you now. But we do see the heads of these many agencies that we have heard about throughout our history. They are directly appointed by the president. Oftentimes they change with new presidents coming into office, but various times some heads of executive agencies are maintained throughout multiple presidential terms, even when presidents are of opposing political parties. So the cabinet consists of roughly 26 specific positions appointed directly by the president and act as an advisory to the president. Now, in contrast to the cabinet, Oh, my apologies. Let's talk about the cabinet in more detail. So, the cabinet, a member of the cabinet would be the head of the Department of Homeland Security. Remember, in 2001, when George Bush created the Department of Homeland Security through an executive order, he also appointed a head to this agency. And that is the extent of his executive powers through executive orders. And now we have a member of the cabinet, the head of the Department of Homeland Security, and we have a body within our executive branch. This was created, as I mentioned previously, through a combination of all or part of 22 different federal departments, which already existed. It was the merging of those departments under one umbrella goal, which was security, domestic security. And we also see that when we look at the functions of the DHS, Department of Homeland Security, you won't have to remember these in detail. You'll primarily have to remember why it was created and who created it. But we understand that they created this with the intention of preventing and responding to terrorist attacks, securing U.S. borders, and managing immigration, a task led by the Department of Homeland Security. Protecting critical infrastructure, both physical, think of transportation and digital, cybersecurity, where your money is nowadays. Responding to natural and man-made disasters through agencies like FEMA, the deployment of FEMA, oftentimes primarily through natural disasters, but it is a bit more expensive than that, and coordinating intelligence efforts among various agencies to ensure a unified approach. And that main point is very important, maintaining unified approach between agencies. That's why we have the Department of Homeland Security. It wasn't to really make a stance for security, but make sure that all these agencies focusing on cybersecurity, physical security, immigration are all working together instead of separately. And another department, and this is the last one we'll cover today, just to help give you an understanding of some of these departments that I previously mentioned, instead of just saying you have department heads and then making you further confused, I want to tell you what these department heads do at times. So the Department of Homeland Security acts as the manager, I guess you could say, of all those branches working together under the general common umbrella goal of national security. So we see the Department of Education. The head of the Department of Education is tasked with acting as the manager of the institution of education and maintaining the adequate functions of this department. So this was first created as the Office of Education within the Department of the Interior in 1867 and was not officially created as the Department of Education until 1979. And we see a lot of the smallest branches of this department operating in very, very early American history, as we have understood the need for federal and national education institutions for a long, long time. So, functions of the Department of Education, they're not simply tasked with educating the youth. Instead, they're tasked with promoting student achievement and preparation for global competitiveness, making sure that what our high school graduates understand about the world is competitive and compares well to those of Norwegian, Russian, Chinese students' understandings as they graduate high school. We also want to ensure equal access to education for all in the United States, making sure that we all have the opportunity for growth through these institutions. We want to oversee federal education funding, make sure that funding is allocated productively, and just be another check against any form of corruption. We also want to enforce federal education laws, make sure that any new laws signed by Congress protecting students, teachers, institution, whatever it may be, is actually enforced. Well, the Department of Education is tasked with making sure that enforcement goes through. And they conduct research and provide data on education. One of their most important responsibilities is studying the tools utilized to teach our youth and helping us understand what is effective and what is not, so we can make that more accessible to all students and promote student achievement. And main takeaway from this is that it was established by Congress in 1979, and the general objectives of this branch, of this department, although I will not be quizzing you on any of this relating to the Department of Education. Now, the bureaucracy. how does the bureaucracy compare to the cabinet? Well, there are millions more people in the bureaucracy than there are the cabinet. And the bureaucracy includes individuals who are not directly appointed by the president. These are individuals, think of the U.S. Postal Service. You're hired because you will be good at the job. These are individuals hired based on merit and not political affiliation on any level. These, merit-based employment. There are 2.1 million federal employees. Additionally, you can see if you include the Postal Service, and I have no idea why some measures do and some measures do not include the Postal Service, but that includes another roughly 500,000. So you can see about 2.5, 2.6 million individuals that consist of federal employees. And of course, they are not directly appointed by the president. The president should not have any say in their employment. These are civil service employees who obtain their position based on merit, their ability to do the job. We do see a slimming down of the federal bureaucracy in recent months, led by President Donald Trump and Elon Musk through the DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency. That is led by a special government employee who has already served his time in office. Although not elected, it is granted based on appointment to have a specialized task for a limited amount of time. And we see that was done for Elon Musk in the Department of Government Efficiency, although not implemented like George Bush implemented the Department of Homeland Security. We do see this as slightly different. And we won't be going into that in detail as that is a bit more complex, but it just stands as an example of what the bureaucracy is, as the bureaucracy consists of those federal employees that were laid off in recent years in the name of efficiency. Recent months. But our primary distinction is understanding the cabinet are advisors to the appointment, advisors to the president, appointed directly by the president, and there's a small collection of those individuals, while the bureaucracy consists of millions of individuals and are not directly appointed by the president. Now, the vice president. What is the most important thing we have to know about the vice president of the United States is that they are the president of the Senate. What? They're the president of the Senate. If there is a tie-breaking vote among our senators, those 100 individuals who are oftentimes tying in their votes. We see many congressional periods having roughly 50 Democrats, roughly 50 Republicans, and we see increases in polarization resulting in decreases in bipartisanship, which often results in much legislation remaining at that 50-50 tie-breaking vote. So the vice president will have to come in and cast the tie-breaking vote to determine if the bill will be enforced or not, or, well, more or less, if the bill will be brought to the president's desk or not, or brought to the House for a vote if it has not been through the House yet. We'll go into detail on that later on. We also see that in the past, the vice president has become the president. 8 vice presidents in U.S. history have later become presidents of the United States, and that trend was especially prominent in early American history. As we remember, John Adams was Washington's VP, Thomas Jefferson was Adams' VP, and we had that continuing on a couple times throughout that time period especially. Now, that trend is not maintained as effectively in recent years, although it does persist, and we do see the vice presidents of the past oftentimes be significant presidential candidates. Joe Biden was Obama's vice president. We see Mike Pence had noteworthy runs for the presidency after being Donald Trump's vice president. So this trend does maintain. And especially in recent years, we have seen a contrasting objective when it comes to finding vice presidents to go along with a president. You oftentimes see, demographically speaking, them act as contrast to the president in order to, and get a little bit more public support. You see Kamala Harris's VP was significantly different, an older, slightly different demographic, different part of the country. You see Donald Trump's VP, J.D. Vance, of course, the Vice President of the United States, standing in somewhat contrast to Donald Trump, younger, different part of the country. You see those trends maintained generally, although they're not the most important thing to remember. Remember that the vice president is the president of the Senate and is tasked with providing tie-breaking votes. Now, we mentioned these fellas a good bit before. The governors. Well, the governors are men or women who have been appointed by the voting population of a state, and they act as the leader of the executive branch on the state level for that specific state. Some state judges are elected directly by governors, appointed by governors, while others are elected by general votes. In Montana, we vote for our state judges, although some states rely on the governor. Some of the powers of the governor include approving new legislation or drafting executive orders on the state level, of course, commanding the state National Guard, managing state executive agencies, appointing state judges, some states, not Montana. They also grant clemency and reprieves for state crimes. We will talk about that when felony disenfranchisement comes up later on in this course. They also interface with other states and federal governments to make sure the interests of their state and constituents are best met. A main takeaway, remember that the governor is the head of the executive on the state level. They maintain a lot of the same powers, but restricted to just the state level, and they also have to interface with other state and federal government representatives. Now, the final point in today's lecture. How does the legislative and judicial branch regulate the powers of the president? Because that is one of the foundations of American history. Remember the Federalist Papers, 52. What is it that they need, that Madison says we need? 51. What is it Madison says we need? We need checks and balances. We need a legislative, judicial, and executive branches that all act independently while also acting as a regulatory agency on the other two. So, what can the legislative branch, our Congress members, the members that are elected to the House of Representatives and the Senate, what can they do to regulate the powers of the executive, our president, cabinet, and bureaucracy? Well, the legislative branch can impeach the president. Remember, the two-step impeachment, House and then the Senate, you have to have it led by the legislative branch. And then we see and they also can impeach more than just the president. They can impeach judges on the federal level. We'll talk about that later on. But we also know the legislative branch also has the power to approve or disapprove of judicial appointments. Think of Supreme Court or federal judge appointments or cabinet appointments. In recent months, we've seen, RFK Jr. is one of the most well-known cabinet appointments of the past presidency. He was approved and is now a member of the cabinet, of Donald Trump's cabinet. We also see that one of the powers that the legislative branch has over the executive is that they have the power of the purse. We talked briefly about wartime powers that the president has. They can deploy troops, but we have checks on the president's ability to deploy troops, as if they don't get approval by Congress within 60 days, the troops are brought back. Why does Congress have to give approval? It's because they have the responsibility of determining the funding. You can't send troops somewhere without it costing money. So you have to eventually have approval by the legislative branch, as they have the power over the purse. Anything regarding federal funding has to be approved by Congress. Now, we also see, and executive orders through many presidents have toted the line on the gray area of that, although we do see many executive orders being overturned by the courts referencing this power. Think of Joe Biden's executive order for giving student loans, and which was overturned by the judicial branch because it excessively granted the president the power of the purse. Cannot do that. That is a legislative power. Why many executive orders have been overturned by the courts. So in a way, that's both a check by the judicial and legislative branch. So we see that the legislative branch has the power to approve treaties signed by the president. Additionally, you need a 2/3 vote for this to go through. So it is very important that Congress and the president are on the same page regarding international treaties. And finally, what can the legislative branch do to be a check on the executive? Because remember, the president can veto legislation. Well, if Congress is strongly unified against a presidential veto, they can override a presidential veto with 2/3 majority in both bodies. So we can have a legislative branch that acts as a check on an unruly executive through these means. Now, what can the judicial branch do to act as a check on an unruly executive? Well, they can determine the constitutionality of executive orders. By that I mean, a great example is looking at those executive orders I provided as examples. Barack Obama's executive order on immigration, Joe Biden's executive order on student loan forgiveness, Donald Trump's executive order on travel restrictions. All of these executive orders, at least their first versions, were struck down by the judicial branch on the basis that they were unconstitutional. The judicial branch has the responsibility of citing only our Constitution and statutory law and determining if presidential actions or actions of the legislature also making sure that they align with our constitutional guiding documents. And if they do not align, the judicial branch, through rulings in district, circuit, or Supreme Court, will determine if it is constitutionally legitimate. And through those executive orders, we see that the courts were able to strike down many of those executive orders as unconstitutional, and the executive branch simply had to accept it because checks and balances. What did we learn? Here are all the questions. Of course, you'll be able to answer them, and the answers are on the next slide. So if you have any questions about any of this, you can always email me. I'm always happy to have a detailed rant over email just to help you better understand the content. Sometimes you just need a different reference. Sometimes there's a different time period or example that I could have utilized to make it connect for you, and reaching out to me and asking for that reference is always a great idea, and I'm always happy to really have some fun political discussions with you. So here are the answers to those questions. And here's what I hope that you can do this week. And oh, somebody's making noise outside my window. But what is due this week? Of course, go through your discussion post. There's a new discussion, so make sure you keep up with that. Check out your readings and complete assignment 2. Assignment 2 is relating to the readings of this week. I want you to write a summary of the readings, and the document around assignment 2 will give you more details on that. And of course, as always, I am happy to help you understand the assignments, the readings, the content, whatever it may be. Just reach out. I'm here to help however I can, and I encourage it. I want to talk with you guys. I'm bored sitting here talking to my computer screen, and it's a lot easier to understand how to teach something when I see how it connects to you. So help me do my job better by telling me what you understand and don't. And if you have any difficulties, please reach out. We got this. Making good progress. Congrats on getting quiz 1 and assignment 1 done. I will get those grades back to you as soon as possible sometime this week. And congrats. Thank you guys for listening to me for another long hour.